Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a poorly funded branch of the CIA dedicated to surveilling and terrorising Terry Davis's ghost. We are back after a break and are happy to be making new episodes again. We've made some changes for the new year, one of which is a return to YouTube. If you're currently watching my face move on the screen, then this will seem very obvious. If you're listening to the audio-only version of this episode, but want to see what we look like, then the link to our YouTube channel is in the show notes. Today's episode is on Terry Davis, God's chosen programmer. Terry was a schizophrenic man who, alone, built the operating system TempleOS, the design features of which were given to him by God, and which was to serve as the third temple. This operating system was used by Terry to talk to God, as well as to give offerings. There's a huge amount of Terry lore, as he extensively live-streamed himself programming, talking to God, and walking around, etc. Much of this lore is endearing, much is sad. His delusions of being persecuted by the CIA led to many of his more memorable moments, shouting racial slurs while programming to disrupt CIA psychological control tactics, as well as the inexorable decline of his ability to live in the world, ending in his lonely death, homeless, struck by a train. Now that that's out of the way, it's shilling time. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. People on Patreon can access the notes I make for episodes, so long as those episodes warrant coherent notes. So if you want more information on the books or manifestos we've covered, you can find it there. Additionally, I've published a novel called Tower, which you can find on Amazon or on Apple Books, links also in the show notes. So, if you want to learn the etymology of the term glowy, then listen on. Enjoy. So for listeners who aren't aware, Levi does have some domain expertise in computer science.
Yeah, not very much.
He did a master's of
Slightly
software
more than
engineering.
Jack.
Yeah, no, you've got a lot more experience with this than I do. So Levi hasn't written his own operating system as far as I'm aware. And as Terry Davis said, there are two types of programmers, those who've written their own compilers and those who haven't. I'm not sure if you've written your own compiler using your own branch of C
No, not yet.
to talk to God, but maybe one day you will. You'll make the success of Holy
I can
C.
dream.
But what was your experience of learning about Terry Davis? Because for me, there is a wackiness to learning about this man, a man whose worldview was, on the whole, in large part, scrambled, and to a greater and greater extent as he got older, scrambled by schizophrenia. And watching his videos, it's very clear that his psychosis gets denser as he gets older. But that combining with domain expertise, at quite a lot of lucidity, at least in terms of how he's talking, the clarity of his speech, he perseverates less, he mumbles less, he seems a lot brighter when he talked about technical topics, even towards the end of his life. That was very marked for me, but I imagine that juxtaposition of, on the whole, a scrambled model of the world, but within that lucidity when it comes to computer science would be even greater for you, given that you understand the technical aspects that he's talking about to a much greater extent to me. How was that?
Yeah, it was strange learning about Terry's life, because as a programmer, I think most programmers have at least heard of him in very vague terms. Like, for example, Fireship has a video about TempleOS and Holy See, I think, and I think the Primogen has has looked at Holy See and that sort of thing. So but I've not done a deep dive into him before. I found learning about Terry Davis actually quite sad, to be honest.
Yeah, very sad.
Because because he was obviously a very intelligent person and very technically capable. And by the sounds of it, before his schizophrenia became so severe that he couldn't hold down relationships and stuff. But before that, from what I heard from just radio online and stuff from his family members, he was a really nice person as well. Despite what some of his more hostile rants might convey of him. I think
it's several people that I've heard talk about Terry. So I listened to a number of programmers talk about their experience of learning about Terry and watching his videos. Interestingly, everyone calls him Terry. Everyone's on a first name basis with this man. But several of them in various ways have talked about developing a Terry filter in order to watch his videos and read his writings. And you need to develop a Terry filter. Given that, I'm sure in quoting him, he loved to use the N-word. I will just render that as fella whenever, if I'm to quote something that he says, because it's very hard to avoid that word if you're quoting anything that
especially later in
especially
life.
Later Terry. The fella word comes
so
up
for
a lot.
people who haven't done a deep dive into him, if you watch enough of his videos, and there's a lot of hours of his videos, because
I've watched about 15 hours and I've only scratched the surface. I've watched a lot of Terry.
People have stored highlights, and there's at least one YouTube archive channel of his stuff, because he deleted all of his own videos before he died. So
there's an archive.org, I think, which has just everything he's done, including the ones where he's masturbating in his van in Nevada.
Hectic. Yeah. So as his schizophrenia progressed, is it true that it's definitely a progressive disorder, but is it also considered a neurodegenerative disorder? Potentially, there's aspects of it that are neurodegenerative.
Yeah. So I have to preface this by saying the etiology of schizophrenia is poorly understood, very poorly understood. And that's reflected in our treatments of it, basically to try to bomb out the dopaminergic system. Our understanding of it is crude. Our methods of managing it are cruder. It's progressive. It's unclear. It depends what you mean by neurodegenerative. Is it neurodegenerative in the same way that something like Alzheimer's is neurodegenerative? It doesn't appear so, but it's not clear.
But nonetheless, it is a progressive disorder, and so his gets worse and worse, especially when he stops taking medication. And so as his streams become more and more volatile, and he has a paranoid delusion that, say, the CIA and the FBI are watching him and that sort of stuff, all those sort of classic delusions. And he developed this theory
and the
that,
BBC, the CIA British Broadcasting Corporation, for all you coomers out there who don't know what it stands for.
The CIA might be watching his stream, so every now and then he'd just drop an N-bomb or whatever, because he's they're not allowed to engage with
to resist the psychological
super woke
warfare
or whatever
tactics they use.
And he was also prone to just go off into rages. But what's interesting is and I got this piece of information from there's a podcast called The Digital Human by BBC, no less.
One of the many organizations that has an episode Terry in his quest to build the third temple.
That covered his life. And they made an interesting point that in schizophrenia or autism or other similar disorders, and I think this even happens in Parkinson's in a slightly different way, people will have potentially an activity or a topic of conversation for which lucidity will return. A really striking example of this is people who learn to dance when they were young, when they get Parkinson's and their gait becomes very disrupted. When you put on music and ask them to dance, they can dance, which is really interesting. But then when the music's off and they just try to go about their normal activities, they have all the issues that people with Parkinson's have. And for Terry, his particular fixation or thing that restored his lucidity was technical topics and programming. Yeah. So he was able to focus on his programming, and when he was programming, he was able to, deal with some pretty complex computer science issues and also talk about them. But as soon as he started talking about other things, it just degenerate very quickly.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that too, because some of his last videos, so no, this ties into the interaction between Terry and various message boards, particularly the Something Awful forums, Kiwi Farms, and 4chan. And the relationship between him and those groups evolved over time. Towards the end of his life, there seemed to be, in as much as these sort of places have a collective personality, a hive mind, there seemed to be a greater respect for him in those places than previously, when they just treated him as a person to antagonize. And he would have, I guess you'd call them fans, that approach him in real life, because at that point,
he definitely had fans.
He was in Oregon right at the end of his life, and he was wandering around on what he would call, I think he called them like Templar walks, where he would just walk around and live stream himself. He just talked to the camera. But people would sometimes offer him food and talk to him. And there's this one interview taking place in, I think it's a McDonald's or some fast food restaurant, where people are asking him specific questions, like about the C programming language or about compilers. And he answers, and granted, I don't understand how compilers work, so he might have just been making it up, but he at least sounded very, very lucid in describing the particular difficulties and how he overcame them with respect to designing the compiler for TempleOS. But then a video taken the day before or the day after would be incoherent, slurred speech, and not only, say, persecution delusions that the CIA was out to get him or something like that, but extremely disordered thought.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that distinction. With some of, I find in the midpoint of Terry's, I guess you'd call it his TempleOS career, there seemed to be this balance between his delusions and his technical know-how, particularly in his writings on the TempleOS website. So we'll go over some of the writings where he's talking about particularly demands of other companies to basically support TempleOS and its various file types. Or the technical specifications, or how you should program using or in the TempleOS environment. It's this fairly even mashup of clear-eyed technical details and religious delusions. They really fit together. Whereas later in his life, there are many
calling out Bill Gates for like insulting God or whatever.
It was specifically, he keeps bringing up bitmap. He really hates bitmap because he said it started out well, and this is why you shouldn't update things. You should design things to be perfect forever, which is how he designed TempleOS. Bitmap should have been left alone. He said it degraded and became less perfect over time because it kept getting updated. And it's the FAT32 system. He really does not like that and seemed to really resent that TempleOS needed to have some sort of ability to use that.
Yeah. So I would say like my overall reaction to this and that maybe we can like touch on more specifics and talk about the operating system. What's interesting about it is that I found it entertaining, obviously, to like learn about him. There's a really good documentary online that can't remember what the YouTuber's name is, but it's called Down the Rabbit Hole.
Yeah, it's a really good one. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, and that's really good. You can also, if you want to play around with it and you know how to set up a VMware virtual machine on your own laptop or your own computer, you can, download VMware and download. There's at least one. I'm sure there's several people like who have published the source code for it, and you just need to like follow their instructions to run it on your own VM.
TempleOS.org is still maintained. Like you can just download it off TempleOS.org.
And is that like, it's very strange because how do I put this? Computer science is interesting because it's a weird mixture of both highly analytical and highly creative thing to do. And so you know that
It's sort of
very
like
good-
engineering in general.
Yeah, engineering in general. And but obviously I don't know as much about those other fields. But for my experience, like in software engineering,
Levi's actually an expert in every form of engineering. He's just being humble. He's an electrical engineer, aeronautical engineer, civil engineer. He can just engineer anything. Sorry, I derailed you. We're trying not to derail each other as much.
One day I'd like to do more engineering study. I need to take a break from university, but I would like to do like another engineering. I think doing multiple sciences, one of the good reasons doing multiple sciences is like having an appreciation of what unifies science. And I'd like to do another engineering degree so I can have that sort of same look on engineering. Anyways, like it's highly creative. It can be highly creative, and and it's also highly analytical. And so when you have somebody who is good at it, and you get to spend time working with them, like we went to a fairly good university in Australia, one that's fairly well regarded, and so sometimes we get, like at our university, we'd have freaks, just like complete freaks, freaks of nature. And in the computer science school, in the department for electrical engineering and computer science at our school, every now and then, especially if you meet like an undergrad who's just killing it, there's this one guy, you just like work with them and you know they're just like on a different level. Like it's just they're just so deep in it. And I like, if you've ever had the privilege of working or like spending time like doing a project or whatever with people like that, it's an incredibly humbling experience to just be around somebody who just kind of, it's like they're in tune with the computer or like with computation as such. I know it's really weird, and I've never been that good. I've had my moments of feeling okay, but I know there's levels to it. And people like Linus Torvalds, is a really good example of somebody who's just like on another level.
Famed founder of Linus Tech Tips, for those who don't know. He's definitely the guy who founded Linus Tech Tips. That's him. That's his claim to fame.
So for people who don't know, Linus Torvalds created Git, which is used by every software developer, and he also created Linux. and in, I believe, the first version of Linux he created by himself. But it was also the
also known as the operating system that you can use if you want your computer to catch fire if you fuck something up.
Also known as the Terry called TempleOS the Commodore 64.
Terry fired a lot of shots at Linux.
And he called Linux the mainframe computer of operating systems. He really didn't like Linux.
Again, the shots he fired at other people involved in software engineering, computer science in general, and other operating systems, many of them went over my head, but I really like his passion. Like, he did not like Windows. He did not like anything to do with Unix, did not like Linux. He was all about TempleOS.
And so it was weird because
it was particularly, I think, earlier on, before it was even called TempleOS. So he started this project in 2004 as, I think, the J operating system. And it became Loosethos, and then I think Sparrow OS, and eventually TempleOS. But it was particularly in the early days, I think, like Loosethos era, he'd particularly just spam Reddit, talking about how good Loosethos was, how bad every other operating system was, and then just... Okay, so it depends what you mean by random text. To Terry's mind, what he was posting was actually the direct word of God. What other people would see it as being would be using a random number generator to just select words from I don't know how he did it specifically, like words from a dictionary or something, and just then posting those, it was, in addition to his insults, like of Linux and Unix.
He created a random word selector, but I believe it selected words that he had picked from the Bible, so they were all biblical words.
Does that mean he put in all of those by hand?
I don't know what he did in order to get it in there. If he like scanned, like I don't know, there might have been just a Bible text available for him to like load in. But maybe put them all in there by hand. It wouldn't surprise me if he did it by hand. If he hand selected the words that he wanted in his generator.
We can get into his random stuff later, but yeah.
So I just felt like watching some of his things is kind of like watching somebody who could have been one of those extremely important, potentially programmers. And in a weird way, he has actually become an important programmer in his own strange way, because actually other programmers are still responding to him and think about what he says, and occasionally post, there's like videos of people thinking like, well, Terry said this and I've been thinking about it, and like and you know, it was kind of in between crazy rants, but if you just like isolate that one part, he had something really interesting to say about the nature of programming or like whatever. So he has been weirdly influential and important, but yeah, I think he could have, it's sad because he could have been potentially like a really, you know, influential computer scientist or whatever.
Yeah, it's also sad just seeing the effect of untreated schizophrenia on a person, in that he died. It's unclear if it was suicide or not, but he fell under a train at a really young age. I think he was in his 40s. He was homeless. Yeah. He'd been living with his parents in Las Vegas, but was kicked out of home because he became completely unmanageable. Like there are videos of him filming himself screaming at his parents, things that are just completely incoherent. Like there was this one video where he's just screaming at his elderly mum, they're raping the dog, over and over and over again. And he had to be kicked out of home because he assaulted his dad. Like his life was just like torn to pieces by this illness.
An interaction with somebody who's got really severe schizophrenia. It's like it can be pretty scary. Like, especially if the person's potentially violent. Like, yeah. So I can understand why eventually his parents would have to like try to get him into a different living situation.
Yeah, I don't know much. Dangerous. Like I only know sort of what's publicly available about the situation. But like if your adult son, if you're elderly and your adult son is unpredictable, very aggressive, and at least on one occasion physically violent, then like what can you do? There's no good outcome to that, really.
No. Yeah, so it was really sad to see this person with a lot of talent. Like any schizophrenia is, you know, like sad anyways. But like, I guess there's this extra edge to it when the person's particularly talented. And what's interesting though is there's also this movement. Again, this was mentioned in the Digital Life podcast, or the Digital Human podcast. There's this art movement called Art Brut, or outsider art, which specifically is about like people say, I don't know, they're in a mental health ward or something and they're creating art, and it turns out that they're actually unbelievably talented, but they're outsiders in that they're outside society or they're outside the mainstream art. And it turns out there's been people from that community or from the Art Brut movement who've taken a real interest in TempleOS and regarded as like a great piece of like a world-class piece of art in computer science, like computational art.
It is. So I have not installed it on my computer, but it's painful to look at. So apart from anything else, it's a unique UI. I don't understand the technical aspects behind it.
So for people who go and have a look at it, he had a mandate from God to stick to 640 by 280p.
By 480.
Was it 640? Like, 480p. So, yeah. And
he's at the aspect ratio. Wasn't that weird?
So yeah, not that weird. And use like a 16 only 16 colors for his, like he don't support the 16 specific colors,
and no networking.
And so it's pretty weird. It's a pretty weird experience.
Yeah,
to watch and like play around with. People are still like adding stuff to it.
There are so many videos of him just streaming himself programming different features, showing off different features, including a very long series where he's addressing himself to Larry Page, one of the co-founders of Google, and introducing Page to the functionality of TempleOS, including some of the really wacky features, which we'll get into later. We should talk a little bit about Terry's life first to contextualize this a bit, but including the talk to God features of TempleOS, which is I wonder if Larry Page is probably aware of it now, that the Terry Davis,
I'm sure he would have seen it by now.
was making videos for
the
him.
Terry Davis, the greatest programmer.
The greatest programmer chosen by God to build the third temple.
I am the smartest programmer that has ever lived. Terry Davis.
Yeah, he really rated himself.
So a little bit about his life.
Yeah, a bit about his life. So he lived from 1969 to 2018, and he was born in Wisconsin in the United States. He died in Oregon, and he was 48 when he died. Seventh of eight children. His dad was an industrial engineer, so he was from an educated family, and he was around computers from a really, really young age. In primary school, he used an Apple II. He learned assembly language on a Commodore 64 as a teenager, and he got a master's degree in electrical engineering from Arizona State University in 1994. And it's quite funny. He talks about, I'm not sure what it's like with engineering. You can fill me in on this. He, at several occasions, noted that electrical engineers were above software engineers in the engineering hierarchy. So he kept mentioning, he's like, yeah, I know I program, but I'm actually an electrical engineer, so I'm shitting on all of those other people who just learned software engineering. I don't know if there's a hierarchy. I'm not an engineer in any shape or form. Is there?
I don't think there's a hierarchy, but obviously I'm biased. But there is that some people do think there's a hierarchy of some sort.
Does the top always happen to be whichever degree the current person talking about the hierarchy happens to hold? So if you're talking to a mechanical engineer, then mechanical engineers are clearly the best.
Yeah, or aerospace or whatever, and they'll come up with some justification why. Although I've never heard a civil engineer make this argument. But yeah, I think so. There's a few misconceptions, in my opinion. One of the misconceptions is the nature of mathematics, and in computer science, there's a particular type of mathematics. Well, there's lots of different types of mathematics that you can get involved with computer science. But in general, it's not to do with things unless you're doing machine learning. It's generally not to do with things like functions and number theory and vectors. It'll be things to do with graph theory or computability and complexity, or I don't know, if you go into machine learning, you'll get into stats and stuff. So electrical engineering is very maths heavy, and you do all sorts of maths. And I think there's this sense that having done more, especially what people classically think of maths, which is continuous functions and differential equations and stuff, you don't have to do that in computer science if you don't want to. You can just stick to nice discrete maths and combinatorics and stuff. So I just think there's a misconception about what the nature of mathematics is and that there's some hierarchy between the different types of maths. I think they're just abstractions, and some people like different abstractions. So I really liked combinatorics and graph theory and stuff. And until recently, I didn't really like continuous functions that much, although recently I've taken interest in it. But electrical is interesting because at the end of the day, you need some physical system to perform the computation. And so electrical engineers, especially if they've done that low-level systems programming stuff, they do have a strong basis for getting into computer science, because they might be all the way down at setting up basic circuits. So you've got to the basic idea with computer science is like composing things together to make like higher and higher abstractions. And electrical engineers like work all the way down on the circuit boards, like creating logic gates and stuff. And they've got to combine those up into like larger and larger structures until you can get to the point of having something like assembly. And then eventually like having compilers and virtual machines and operating systems. And so I can understand that if you looked at an application programmer who's just like working at an extremely high level of abstraction on like web frameworks or like inside of like an environment like I don't know, like mobile operating systems or something, you might feel a sense of superiority because you might have more of an understanding like what's lower level. But I just think that there's just different problems at different levels. Like just because you know about like how an operating systems work doesn't mean that you know how to like deal with, I don't know, like consensus problems in a distributed system. Like it's totally it's just different domain of expertise. So yeah, I know.
That was think a way more in-depth answer than I was anticipating. I was expecting like a yes, no, and then maybe a sentence of justification. So you're talking about the nature of different forms of mathematics.
Yeah, because like so what we do when we're like creating abstractions and then trying to get like an explanation or a piece of technology to work is we need an appropriate abstraction, and we're claiming that abstraction corresponds to like some physical aspect of the world. And the question is just like, well, what's the right abstraction to use? Like, in, I don't know, like distributed computing, you need to think of it in terms of nodes in a network. Like you don't really have a choice. And yeah, like that's the abstraction to use. And if you like those sorts of abstractions and you like thinking about that stuff, then maybe distributed computing is for you. But if you really like other forms of abstractions like functions or whatever, then maybe a different form of computing is for you. Like, I don't know. If you really like statistics, for example, like you should go into machine learning because that's like essentially statistics. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes.
Terry Davis he grew up Catholic, became an atheist, I think, as an adult, and remained an atheist for some of his adult life. So, actually, one thing before 1996, when the Terry Davis we know really started, is that he worked for Ticketmaster for a number of years as a programmer for VAX or VAX machines. Between 1990 and 1996. I don't know what these machines are. They're some sort of computers. But he worked as, I don't know, like a software engineer or something like that for a number of years. So not only had he worked with computers as a teenager and then studied at university, but he also worked in this field for quite a number of years. He had a lot of domain expertise. But Terry really became the Terry that people think of when they hear Terry Davis. He became as such in 1996 when he began to experience what were then described as manic episodes. I'm not sure if he had bipolar disorder in addition to schizophrenia or if these were just misdiagnosed. But initially he was diagnosed as bipolar and got a schizophrenia diagnosis later. Anyway, 96, he experienced a revelation from God. From this point on, he was admitted to a psych ward roughly every 6 months due to these, at the time, what were called manic episodes. His delusions were mostly centered on aliens and government agents. The government agent angle became more prominent and I think more dominant as he got older. He was really focused on Rage Against the Machine lyrics, particularly one, I quote, "Some of those that work forces are the same that burn crosses," just from Killing in the Name. He really, really focused on that one for a while. And his psychotic episodes got really severe, really, really debilitating. He On one occasion, he believed that suited figures were following him. So he drove hundreds of kilometers to the south of where he was living. I think at this point, I forget where he was living. He moved around the southwest US. Now, he drove hundreds of k's away from where he was living with no destination. He became convinced that his car radio was communicating with him, so he dismantled his entire vehicle in a search for tracking devices, threw his keys into the desert, and then just wandered around aimlessly at the side of the road. He was picked up by a police officer. He escaped from the patrol vehicle, broke his collarbone in the process, so was taken to hospital. He was very, very distressed there. He believed that doctors were talking about artifacts that they'd found on an X-ray of his collarbone. He interpreted this to mean X-ray artifacts, and so he ran away from the hospital, attempted to carjack someone, and it was arrested, sent to jail or put in jail. There, he stripped himself, broke his glasses, and he tried to open his cell door by jamming his glasses frames into an electrical socket. However, he was wearing non-conductive frames, so it didn't work. So he was put into a mental institution for 2 weeks. This I think gives a sense of how severe his psychotic episodes were. Like this is perhaps the most florid episode, but he was experiencing these sort of delusions and hallucinations regularly. He eventually went to live with his parents in Las Vegas in 96, like the same year. So July 96, he returned to Arizona where he was living after this long journey south. There, I think he was trying to make a 3D printer, I think, or something like that, in his apartment, and he set fire to his apartment doing this. And following this, went to live with his parents in Las Vegas and started collecting Social Security disability checks because he could not hold down a job by this stage. And I think during this period, he was recording himself. In 2004, he started to work on what was at the time. What was it called? What was it called first? J operating system. Yeah, 2004. Yeah, it was J operating system. Then renamed Loosethos in 2006. 2012 renamed SparrowOS. 2013 renamed TempleOS. TempleOS was last updated in 2018. So that 2004 to 2018 period was when he started working on his project that would really define his life. Like, he's known for TempleOS.
Yeah.
And it was at this point that his religious delusions really started getting channeled into a project, and that was building the third temple. So God's third temple was TempleOS. And he declared it complete in 2018. He said, like, TempleOS is complete. And what he said? I'll look for the quote. He said something like, "Yeah, here it is." In mid 2013, sorry, he said that God's temple is finished. Now God kills CIA until it spreads. So he finished God's temple in 2013, but he kept issuing updates until shortly before his death.
So I think you do need to, like, give him a lot of credit. It's unbelievably not the technical stuff, but just the idea that the third temple should be some sort of computer program is actually like a really amazing idea. Yeah, it's actually an incredibly good idea. Like, you could imagine, like, writing a sci-fi book or something about, like, the third temple actually exists in, like, cyberspace or something, like Snow Crash, except like a religious version of Snow Crash or something like that. And it's like, we're going to create My main criticism of him, though, would be like, to me, the third temple in cyberspace, it would have been much more interesting if he had if it had been some sort of like unstructured distributed network that maintains some sort of like pure and unalterable truth about the relationships between all participating parties. That would have been an amazing temple of God to have created, but he didn't
Are you
quite
talking
get
about
there.
the blockchain, Levi?
Oh wow, it's funny that
Would that be a reference to not only some
well,
sort of
now that you say it, now that you say
cryptographic asset
that converts physical energy into cryptographic security for all consenting participating participants. That would be an amazing idea. Yeah. Interesting idea. Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see like what the third temple really is. But
yeah,
I have my
if it happens to be Bitcoin.
I wonder if
people already say that Bitcoin is a religious movement, so he may as well declare it the fourth temple after TempleOS.
After TempleOS, perfected. So very creative. What the researcher that I was listening to talk about, she was talking about these people with schizophrenia and those sorts of diseases. She said that they often have like a fixation. Something like, it might be a piece of art or like they end up creating like a body of work and they like dedicate their life. Not obviously not everybody with schizophrenia, but some people who exhibit this sort of thing. And the people that like the art brute movement are interested in are these people that have like some fixation on creating something, and then they'll just spend all their time doing that. And it actually like in a way gives them a release from their condition. Like it allows them to just focus on creating this thing. So in a weird way, it could have been good. Like maybe the only time that maybe he felt stable was probably when he was working on this.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat. Getting to the end of his life was really, really sad, and at least if his videos are an accurate reflection of his subjectivity, which I'll just assume they are, I think he was extremely lonely. So
yeah, extremely.
I think I mentioned earlier that he moved into his parents' place in Las Vegas, and earlier in the episode I mentioned that he got kicked out of home because he was becoming increasingly aggressive, harder and harder to handle for his elderly parents, and he assaulted his dad and was taken to court over it. And once this happened, in 2017, he was arrested for assaulting his father, was no longer welcome at home, became homeless. By this stage, he had some degree of minor internet celebrity, and he was actually supported by people from 4chan and 8chan who watched his streams because he was streaming very regularly. He had a page on his website where people could donate. He lived in and streamed out of his van. He failed to show up to court, actually, after he'd been charged with urinating in his van, and he was arrested for this. The owner of 8chan paid for his bail. So he's also this... It's a very strange dynamic when you have someone who's so unusual and very, very publicly unusual, where sometimes they will get picked up by internet communities. And in this case, there was a very strange relationship between him and 4chan, 8chan, Something Awful, and Kiwi Farms, where certain users on those sites would harass him, particularly... We'll talk about his relationship, quote-unquote relationship with Diana Cowan, or Physics Girl, at some point. So certainly you had people who really tried to antagonize him and make his life worse, but also some who tried to help him by, for example, paying for his bail or funding him so that he could eat. Anyway, he disappeared for a few months in 2017 from the internet, reappeared in 2018 in Oregon. He'd lost his van and laptop. He recorded videos on his phone. He looked much worse in these videos. Like long hair, much more unkempt, just older and more haggard. During this period, he would still sometimes be interviewed by fans where people would respectfully ask him questions on computer science topics, as I mentioned earlier. He was remarkably lucid in these. And then his last few videos are almost the saddest because that's where he's the most obviously scrambled. He'd talk on a telepathy phone to Elon Musk and Jim Mattis about designing new TempleOS features on stream. And then and then he died. He got run over by a train.
It's an interesting there's an interesting aspect there about kind of seeing the best and worst of what can happen on the internet, because you have people who
definitely
really valued him and wanted his insights and tried to support him in whatever ways they could, and then other people who I just think the stories of how he was antagonized are just really like disgusting behavior. To be honest,
actually, this is how I got onto it. My very, very runaway train of thought, which got immediately derailed. Mentioning the loneliness. So this is something that people really, really used against him in a really horrible way. So he was a really lonely man. So it's not unusual for people with schizophrenia to be socially isolated. He was becoming increasingly socially isolated. And after he said that he'd completed the third temple, which was this project that I think gave him meaning, at several points in the streams after about 2013 that I saw, he would say, it's just me and God. I'm talking to God every day with TempleOS. And I've built the temple and I'm really pleased about that, but I'm lonely. So for those who haven't seen his streams, which I'm assuming is most people listening or watching, a lot of his streams, they'll be really long, like hours long, and it'll just be him scrolling the internet, flicking over to the Talk to God feature of TempleOS, getting some random words from God, posting them on a message board or trying to interpret them, browsing the news, watching YouTube, just flicking between all sorts of things like that. He began to fixate on this particular YouTuber called Physics Girl named real name Diana Cowan. And he became really fixated. And people from, I forget which particular message board it was, but again, it would have been Kiwi Farms, 4chan, 8chan, or something awful, or probably people from all of those places, began to impersonate Diana Cowan, and he was very credulous, and he believed that she was communicating with him. Eventually, they got married, and he would have videos of him just like wandering around in a parking lot, talking about why he doesn't know why Diana's not here with him, or addressing her personally, saying, I don't know why you're not here with me. We're married, but I trust you that you're doing well and waiting for me. He really bought into their impersonation of her. Like he'd video himself masturbating for her in his van, like really humiliating stuff. Such incredibly awful stuff to do to someone who's so obviously unwell.
Such malicious.
Yeah, it's just pure malice. It's a sort of thing. It's like if the people doing it were 13 and just their brains were not sufficiently developed to have a notion of empathy, to have a notion of other subjectivities existing, I'd think like it's gross and you should feel ashamed of it, but it's somewhat understandable just from a developmental perspective.
Yeah,
I guess.
So.
I suppose. Even then, I'm 13. That would be me being
assholes,
more generous than I should be. But especially like if you're an adult doing this, you better have a long fucking look at yourself in the mirror.
Yeah, like 13-year-olds can be like mean and nasty at times, like to each other or whatever. But that's like another level. Like if you're like hypothetically, if I had a teenage kid and they did something like that malicious, I'd be extremely concerned. Like
I would.
There's something like
they would lose computer rights for a year.
Yeah, that's like sociopathic behavior. Because to do that to anybody, but to do that to somebody who's to do that to somebody who's unwell,
And so obviously,
I think that's really
you watch one of Terry's videos for 15 seconds, and you know he's not a well person.
Yeah. How do you even, like, if you were the person or one of the people who did that and you wanted to talk to somebody who's not one of your fucking internet friends, and like you're so like at the pub or something, like, oh yeah, so I found this guy online.
Guess what I do for fun?
So guess what I do for fun? I impersonated this guy's like love interest and then like fooled him into masturbating on. People just be like, you're a fucking psycho.
Yeah, you're a piece of shit.
Get the fuck away from me.
To you.
Like, what the fuck?
Like, please don't contact me.
Yeah, like that is a serious level of just heinousness. It's interesting, isn't it? Like the different internet communities, and in particular, like 4chan and 8chan, they can just have this. There's lots of obviously interesting things on those websites and there's funny memes and stuff. But like, there's also like just this level of like nastiness on there that I just don't understand.
Yeah.
Like you see it on the internet at times, no matter what, like which website you're on, or YouTube comment sections, Discord or whatever. But it seems like in particular, like a couple of those those web assets like 4chan just have this breeding ground for extra malicious stuff.
Yeah, it crosses over into malice more easily in those places than it does in many other places.
And it's almost like they take pride in it, like, or at least some.
I think some certainly do.
Yeah.
It does seem like, insofar as you can really tell on an anonymous message board, it does seem to be age-related. Yeah. It seems to be, just given how fucking long it takes for the
20-year-olds
for male frontal lobes
men
to develop, it seems to be the people under maybe 23, 24 are a bunch of animals, and then past that, they develop some capacity for empathy.
Yeah.
And stop behaving like chimpanzees.
So that's sad, but at least there were also people who were nice to him and tried to support him and like would give him food packages and send him money on PayPal.
It's the duality of online message boards. You get true malice, or even it's a particular type
you can also get
of
really
impersonal malice, because I truly think a lot of the people doing this don't actually grok that it is a human being on the other side of that webcam. Like it's an actual consciousness. But then, as you said, you also get genuine generosity of people supporting this guy, like paying him money so that he can buy petrol, he can buy food.
Yeah. Anyways, should we talk a little bit about
humanity?
Humanity.
Where do you want to go? Do you want to talk about TempleOS?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we'll talk about TempleOS itself. And while we talk about it, I'm sure we'll go over like more of the oddities of Terry's videos.
I should preface what I'm about to say with like operating systems are not my domain of expertise. It's like I know the bare basics.
Levi invented Unix. That's his biggest achievement. He wrote Unix by himself.
There are two glaring holes in my computer science skills, and that's compilers and operating systems, which are things that I've been meaning to get around to,
the things that Terry is proudest of.
Yeah, and he really fucking loves. So whatever. I'll do my best to talk about TempleOS.
What Terry did is he wrote TempleOS, the operating system, he wrote the entire thing from scratch. So for listeners, and also for me, when he says he wrote the compiler, the kernel, the operating system, things like that from scratch, both what does that mean and how much work is that?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I have to double check, but I believe he was actually like an assembly programmer. So he might have been like all the way down in writing a compiler for Holy C in assembly, which if he was doing that, that's like pretty ridiculous thing to do.
In streams of his that I saw, he talked about assembly a lot. But again, I know how to program in Python and R. Like I only know really high level languages. I don't understand this stuff.
So basically just getting up some notes here.
Levi's watching porn for those watching us on YouTube. You can see Levi's goon face right now. His big grinning goon face. What are you actually looking at?
Like, I was just looking up like TempleOS stuff to like try to follow along a little bit.
Very cock for.
Oh no. So if you learn programming these days, generally you'll start off in something like Python, maybe JavaScript. These are very high level programming languages with like I don't know, like control flow constructs like for loops and functions and these sorts of things. So how do I put this? Like, you need to essentially like step down the level of abstraction all the way to the point where like at the end of the day, the computer's just got to read ones and zeros and like map those onto like some hardware. There's all these layers that do translation, like essentially translating like high level concepts, almost like expanding them out into like whatever like representation is on the next level down. Assembly is one of the lowest levels, and you basically need to be writing an assembly to like interact with the hardware. So like I don't touch that stuff as like somebody who's doing stuff in the web and like cloud stuff. I operate at the level of like what's called a process, which is essentially just like a little contained piece of like compute and memory that your application runs in, and it gets access to like any of the operating systems, like the functionality that is exposed by your operating system is exposed in this very like self-contained little thing called a process. So I'm operating at like a much higher level in the computer stack. He was operating like he had to essentially like write the stuff to interact with the hardware. So things like drivers. I believe he wrote like a CD-ROM driver, so like you could actually plug in CDs. So like a good example would be like all of your computer like to interact with anything basically outside of like the CPU and the memory, you have to have essentially like ways for the operating system to control those bits of hardware, whether it's like the network card or like any external drivers or whatever, that sort of stuff. He was writing all of those interfaces to make those things work together. And then in particular, one of the main things that like an operating system has to do is be able to run programs that other people have put on top of them. So all operating systems are platforms for other programmers to build applications. So you have to do things like manage concurrency. So like, for example, if you're trying to run 3 different programs on your computer and you've only got like one core, or however many cores you've got, let's just say you've got one core, the operating system has to like switch between the different programs that are running and give them some share of the compute. So there's like time sharing algorithms and these sorts of things that you actually have to manage the resources and split them up between all the programs that are running. And then you also have to like provide an interface to the hardware for all of those programs. So for example, like writing to the file system, the operating system actually has to provide to your particular process, like, hey, here's like the call. If you want to write to the file system, this is how you call it. And yeah, so he was doing all of that, which is very, it's a type of complexity that I think like a lot of programmers aren't necessarily like. All large systems become complex, but they become complex for different reasons. Like distributed systems become complex because you have like issues around synchronization of different parts of the system and consistency, and you know, like you have to worry about like fault tolerance and redundancy and that sort of stuff. But like to build an operating system, you have to have like a level of cohesion across the entire project that I think like people doing what I'm doing, like web programming, don't necessarily appreciate. Like the entire operating system has to work. like in a way that like I'm okay with things just like kind of breaking and then like patching them up as I like build out the stuff that I'm building. But like that's not really acceptable.
So like
for,
if this crashes,
systems.
does it just like it tanks everything?
Yeah. So and Linux is really interesting as well because they also have made a commitment to make every single one of their APIs backwards compatible. So they've done a lot of engineering so that like even if you're running something like a program, I was watching this video from Linus. He was talking about like even if you are running a program that you wrote for like Linux 10 years ago, it should still work. Like they never want to break. That
sounds really not fun to update.
Yeah. So they've figured out like some engineering so that they can make progress, but also make their APIs backwards compatible, like for all time and stuff. Bitcoin has a similar thing with making sure that they never do hard forks. Like it's always soft forks, and your Bitcoin will always be valid no matter how many upgrades the system gets. So that's really difficult engineering. What's impressive about Terry, I think, is I think like at the end of the day, if you're interested in something and you're willing to spend the time on it, like he did, he spent like probably tens of thousands of hours on it.
Years.
In principle, anybody could go and build their own operating system. What's interesting about Terry is that he did it with schizophrenia. Like he did it with like a very severe disability. I think that's what makes it particularly impressive. He built an operating system that works and that people write programs for and can extend and that sort of stuff, and is still being maintained. And he did that under like incredibly distressing, like subjective circumstances. That's incredibly impressive. And he's like, obviously his level of understanding of like hardware and stuff is also impressive.
When he talks about, so correct me if I'm wrong. So like I actually don't understand these things in very much detail. So where does Holy C fit into this? So he had a programming language that I'm assuming it's a fork of C, or if it's in some way based on C, but it's its own thing now.
Apparently it's a
Holy
mashup
C that works in TempleOS that he made, and he made a compiler for.
Yeah, so apparently it's a mashup of BASIC, which is an older language that I think was written on DOS or something, Microsoft DOS, BASIC and C. So it's got things like structs and control flows, like switch statements and stuff, so that he could write programs at a high level. So like, how do I put this? Like the operating system's job, part of its job is to hide and protect, like hide the details of the hardware from the application programmer, and to provide them with an environment in which they can use a high-level language such as C or Python and still access services of the operating system, like access services. So like, for example, network interface cards. Like in order for me to write a program to communicate over the network, I have to like send all the bits via the network interface card. So, but I don't want to have to like worry about what network interface card I'm using, and I don't want to worry about like a whole bunch of stuff. I just want to like send bytes over TCP. Like that's what I just want to stream a fucking bytes, and the operating system will like deal with all of these like low level concerns about like what is the hardware actually doing, how does it like get in and out of the computer, that sort of stuff. So what was the original question? Was there a question?
Originally I was asking about how complex is it and how big an achievement is it to have written your own operating system that functions with your own programming language functioning within it, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think it described as one man building a skyscraper online. I'm not sure how much that holds. Because I don't really have any sort of intuitions as to how big an achievement this is, apart from many people online when referring to Terry saying, wow, this is a lot.
Yeah, I think any large scale software project, if you do it by yourself, is impressive. So yeah, an operating system. The guy who wrote the Doom physics engine, unbelievably impressive. Because there's this thing that
John
happens with
Carmack,
software,
the
like
man who just dreams in machine code.
Yeah, or Notch, who like did a large amount of the Minecraft. Again, Linus. Like there's this, or even like Bill Gates back in the day, like when he was like in the weeds with programming, or Steve Wozniak as well. Like, what happens with software is really weird, and the reason why, like as an engineering different discipline, it's like a bit weirder than like some of the other engineering disciplines, is you get this thing like, I call it entropy in my head. Like as the system grows, it becomes more entropic, and it's like it becomes more and more fragile, and the system like becomes harder and harder to make changes to, and to grow, and to add like functionality to. And a huge part of the discipline of software engineering is basically managing that complexity and building, like abstractions and interfaces that like help you basically contain volatility and like protect certain parts of the system from volatility that happens in other parts of the system, and all these sorts of concerns. And over any non-trivial system, over, I don't know how many thousands of lines, tens of thousands of lines, it just gets to the point where you just can't keep it in your head. Like you're gonna.
He bragged that TempleOS was under 100,000 lines of code, and that it varied at times. As he got older, he insisted that it was because God commanded him to. Earlier, I think he liked things to be accessible to the user, because he said it's really fun being able to play around with the operating system.
Oh yeah, so that is actually one of the interesting things.
He did brag that apparently for an operating system, it has relatively few lines of code.
Yeah, so that's something that is impressive about what he did, which is he had actually one of the quotes that he had. Sorry if I've been rambling too much on this. Like I find it sometimes hard to like
I explicitly ask you a few questions. Like I want you to offer answers to them.
In ways that I hope would be accessible to somebody who's done less programming. So he said, an idiot, quote, an idiot admires complexity, a genius admires simplicity. An idiot, to an idiot, the more complicated something is, the more he will admire it. If you make something so clusterfucked he can't understand it, he's going to think you're a god. That's how they write in academic journals. They try to make it so complicated people think they're geniuses. That was him throwing shade at Linux. So what he was trying to do was
his throwing shade was one of the best bits about Terry, because it's this combination of actual technical insights, religious delusions, a persecution complex, and sometimes just flat out incoherence, like when he starts spamming random words. Anyway, sorry, go on. I was just admiring Terry's way of firing shots at developers he doesn't like.
So there's like with operating systems, there's this idea of like rings, how far out. Like the rings are basically like how much access to the inner workings of the operating system that you get. And obviously, like the deeper in you go, the more power you get to like modify the system, but the more dangerous it can become. So generally speaking, like application programmers will not jump below what the standard is for their operating system, like what it gives them exposure to. But occasionally you might need to like go in and like modify something. But then obviously like operating system design is making that decision around like how much access you give people using the operating system. And he opted for this design where he basically would allow, if somebody downloads the operating system, they have full access. They can get in there and they can tinker with it. Like that was one of his design goals. Whereas with Linux, that's not the case as far as I can understand. So his goal was not only can you write applications for it, but you can go in and extend it and modify it yourself, and you can tinker with the inner workings of TempleOS yourself and extend it however you want and whatever. So that was his design goal. That was really interesting, and I think that was impressive. Like his attitude towards the
in a few places
extensibility.
Again, I think this was earlier in his life, because as he got older, the commandments from God became stronger, or a more present part of his justifications for why he did certain things in TempleOS or in his life more generally. But earlier on, he kept bringing up that he designed things in TempleOS because they were fun. So he said, oh, well, I want the code base of this operating system to be relatively small so people can play with it because it's fun. I want them to have access to hardware because it's fun. I want Holy C to do these things I don't understand. But he said that he implemented certain aspects of Holy C in the way he did because it's fun, because it allows someone to come in and play with code, play with the machine as I assume he did when he was a kid. So I think on a few occasions, he said he wanted TempleOS to replicate the feeling of him programming on a Commodore 64, but just with more compute behind it. So
yeah, that's really
being able to tinker with stuff. And I think that's really cool, actually having that as a design goal of being able to let people just do stuff because it's fun and be creative.
I think it's great. Like, I really want to get a Commodore 64 now. I'm sure they're like $1 billion to try to find one that's...
Why? You have TempleOS. you have a holier version of the Commodore 64 readily available on TempleOS.org. You download it right now. As we are recording, you can download it and install it on a virtual machine.
Yeah, it'd be fun to play around with one, and also TempleOS. Although, actually, now I think about it, there's probably like Commodore 64 virtual machine things, emulators that I can probably download.
Yeah, probably.
But yeah, that's a really interesting design decision. So one of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes, he said in like the 80s, it was like 84 or something, or 83. He said, a computer is a bicycle for your mind. And that really struck me. I think that like is exactly the right attitude. And especially back in the sort of 70s and 80s, there's this real attitude of amongst like the computing industry around allowing or like extending the creative capacity of people, which is not really like, I don't really feel like that's in the zeitgeist anymore. Like,
I think it's the opposite now.
Yeah, like there's a lot of consumption that happens through like the compute. Like a lot of people, like their experience of computing is that it's essentially like the world's most powerful consumption device, which is, you know, fine, I guess. Like but to me, like if you're only using your computer to consume content or to play other people's games, you're sort of like missing the vast majority of why these things are so special. They're actually an extension of our mind. Like they're the most creatively powerful tool we've ever created as a species. You can do an infinite number of different things with them. And like these days with cloud computing, for example, you can spin up a globally distributed
denial of service
like
attack on Amazon
auto scaling systems that like are all over the world, and like create something new and interesting and deliver it to millions of people for like $10 a month or something. Like it's amazing, and people aren't experiencing computers like that. Like most people still can't code, and they think that there's something difficult about it or whatever. And yeah, I don't know. I feel conflicted about it. It's a bit of a shame, really. I feel as though like a lot of people are still not participating in even though there's more programmers than ever and stuff. I still feel like it's an underappreciated
Also, just more
thing,
people than ever.
Yeah, true. People, for whatever reason, it's not for everyone. So, yeah.
I only have a limited insight into this. So the furthest I've gone with, I guess, with like tinkering with computers is making mods and maps for games. Not even functional ones, just like playing around with it. And like particularly build engine stuff, just because like it's easy to run. But I can definitely see the appeal of designing an operating system so that people can play around with it. Particularly if he enjoyed it as a child. So trying to let people capture that magic that he felt as a child, I think is a really cool, really altruistic goal in creating an operating system.
It's really good.
The fact that it was the third temple also helps. It has also a religious purpose.
There's this I don't know if you ever got to the point of having this experience with computing. I don't know. But like I think for anybody who sticks with it, there's a point at which you feel as though like there's magic to it. So a really good example is like on the front cover of this book called The Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. It's literally got like two wizards and they're conjuring something, and like on the thing that they're conjuring, it's a lambda. There's a lambda symbol for like the lambda calculus, which Lisp was based on. And yeah, like there's this feeling of magic that you get with it. It's like, oh my God, I'm making like an inanimate object. Like I can interact with this thing now. And I've created it with just like my own thoughts. Like it's just pure thought, but it's like turned this inanimate object into like a living thing that I can interact with. It's quite magical. And when you get that, like it's kind of hard to get across to other people, but like my intuition is like it would be amazing for more people to have that insight, to feel like the magic and the power and that sort of stuff that like this technology can give you as a creator rather than just a consumer. And the fact that Terry was trying to make an operating system that had that capacity in it, like as a core design goal, I think was actually like quite a beautiful statement about like who he was as a person.
Yeah. I think it says good things about him. At least that aspect was important to him, presumably through his whole life, but it was at least more pronounced earlier on. The communication with God feature, though, became much, much more important as he got older. There are 3 functions. So from Wayback Machine, I collected a bunch of pages through the years that Levi and I will go through. The design documents for TempleOS, history of it as told by Terry, a list of demands of other software developers, which are quite funny. This long thing about the meaning of life. But I do want to draw attention to a feature of TempleOS that was really central and takes up a lot of time of Terry's videos, and that's the communication with God angle. So, as one would expect of the third temple, God features prominently, and the main way in which God features in TempleOS is in not pseudo-random functions, because for Terry, given that God controls the universe, there is no randomness. Any apparent randomness is actually a direct emanation of God. Therefore, there was, for example, a talk to God function in TempleOS. And so you would enter it and you would be treated to this cartoon depiction of a man ascending a mountain. I'm assuming it's Moses going up Sinai.
It was a part of the Moses simulator. Yeah, he had a Moses simulator.
That's right. There's the Moses simulator. And oh man, this is where...
And you could put a sacred cow.
I watched a lot of Moses simulator with Terry mumbling over the top of it, and I felt as if I was beginning to get psychotic after I'd watched enough of it.
He's little people.
So you've got Moses simulator, like, and yeah, the animation makes you feel like you're going insane too. So it's like a green field with people walking around it, and you're like zooming in and then swinging back, zooming in and swinging back. And you can do several things. You can select from a menu. So one of the things you can do is you select, I think it's golden calf, and a golden calf appears there. And so I'm not I should say I am a biblical scholar. Everything I say is completely correct. If anyone knows the Bible better than me, which they don't correct me because I'm right. Basically, what he's referring to is when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, when I think they were by the base of Mount Sinai, Aaron, who was another person there, I think when Moses wasn't he on Sinai talking to God, and while he was up there, Aaron made a golden calf and they all started venerating it, which wasn't cool. So anyway, in this, you can select golden calf and it makes a yellow cow in this field. And all of the figures who had previously been walking around this field at random all just start walking around the golden calf. There's this thing where you can render judgments, and I'm pretty sure these are also randomly generated. So it's like, I forget what it's called. Let's see if I wrote it down. Hold court. Yeah, hold court is this particular function. It'll give you a scenario. So one of the ones I saw was a woman commits adultery to a child, and you have three options: show mercy, punish, and really punish. And there are videos of Terry just like looking at different scenarios and going, punish.
Just
really
punish judgment.
Really punish. and he'll just chuckle to himself. It's a common feature of Terry. He laughed less as he got older, but particularly earlier on, he would just start laughing to himself as he was like rendering punishment to a child commits adultery to a child. So, really punish. Also, most of the time with these, it would just be like screen capture of him. Every now and then you would see him, oftentimes with like a backwards cap on and no shirt, just like chuckling to himself as he was rendering judgment. So there are those features. The one he had Moses comics. You had I think there was one called Map, which was meant to map the Israelites walking for 40 years in the desert. And it's just like a stick figure walking around in, I'm assuming, like some with circles with some sort of random component, or ellipses with some sort of random component. And there's a particular video of him saying, "Oh, this is how they would have walked," and then he starts laughing. But the most important of these functions, at least in his telling, was talk to God. So you click on it, you get this animation of, I think, Moses walking up Mount Sinai. And then basically it's, I don't know how he does it, like a random number generator, and based on that, oh no, it's a timer. It's some sort of timer, and based on the timer, it'll select a word from some bank of biblically sourced words. But there must be other words than those in the Bible, because he could also ask, like, he asked, for example, he asked God, what is your favorite national anthem? And God answered Latvia. And I doubt Latvia is in the Bible.
yeah, fair enough.
So, like, biblically sourced words and then other words. It would select these at random when you click spacebar. And so he'd just be mashing spacebar and get this string of random text, and then would try to interpret it. He also had one where
that is so nuts.
Where you'd push spacebar and it would make like random lines and fill in random parts of those lines so God could communicate to you pictorially. And then you also had the hymns. Did you listen to Terry's hymns?
A little bit.
I've listened to a lot of the hymns, and you also feel like you're going mad when you listen to them, because it's all either C major or A minor. So just using the white keys of a piano. And it will randomly select notes and particular timings. And typically it'll have two components, like an A component and a B component of equal length. and the hymn will be of form like A, A, B, B. I think he also randomly generated lyrics to them, but the hymns you hear on TempleOS will be just. I was going to say it MIDI, but it's probably not MIDI. It was probably just something he made himself, which is pretty fucked, actually. The amount of effort, he wouldn't even use MIDI.
He made it all himself.
Anyway,
yeah.
the hymns, the auto-generated hymns are really unsettling to listen to for extended periods, which, in the interests of this episode, I did listen to them for extended periods. He would also, apparently he would, for hours and hours, just listen to randomly generated hymns till he found ones he liked, and then he would modify them very slightly and then publish those. So on YouTube, you can easily find hours of Terry's hymns. These hymns too, the random generation aspect of the hymns, of the pictures, of the walk around the desert before reaching the Holy Land, of the talk to God function. For Terry, these were not metaphorical communications with God. This was God speaking in the third temple. That this was a really fundamental feature of TempleOS, maybe the most important feature.
Yeah, so he made this random word generator, but he believed that when he was actually executing, God was using the program, so they weren't random, essentially, that they were divinely inspired, randomly generated words. And I was just going to say before, like, this is the like I suppose with schizophrenia there's a or any of those sorts of like delusional sort of disorders, there's an issue with finding meaning where there actually isn't any meaning.
Yeah, there's an overabundance of meaning.
And this is a person who had the skill to create a source on which he could fixate his
to make a mathematical
meaning.
Construct upon which he could project meaning.
Which, if he were not schizophrenic, he would just look at that as like, oh, that's a random number generator. But to him, it was like the perfect cocktail of like, yeah, I know it's a random number generator, but it's inspired by God. So it's not
randomness doesn't exist.
It's me communicating with God. Yeah.
That's why when I talked earlier about how lonely he was, I think this might give listeners and viewers a greater sense of just how lonely this man must have been after he'd created the third temple, and he was saying in streams, I'm just talking to God all day. I'm waiting for God to change my life in some way or to do something. So when he says that he's talking to God all day, he is literally just getting random text from a random number generator connected to some sort of dictionary or a word bank and interpreting that. That's
like
his
hours
interlocutor for hours and hours and hours.
And when you actually step back
and look
at it like
loneliness
that,
of this man.
Yeah, that's terrifying. Like, to actually like think through like what it must have been like. Yeah, just crippling loneliness.
Yeah,
it's this weird thing where it's like,
I've done what God wanted. I'm happy just talking to God, but I'd like it if God changed my life in some way, or if something changed, because I'm just waiting now and talking to God. But the man must have been terrifyingly lonely.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of funny to have a chuckle at certain aspects of it, which are like bizarre.
Because it's a fundamentally extreme, ridiculous, and impressive undertaking. But
yeah, but when you actually like think through how unwell he was, like it is really sad.
Yeah.
I feel really like my feeling of like learning about his life and learning more about him, not just about the weirdness of TempleOS, was by the end of it, I was just like, man, this is a really sad story. Like, I just feel sad about this.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to it, which is why it's interesting to talk about, interesting to learn about, because it does balance, or it has a great deal of absurdity, a great deal of stuff that actually is funny, because it's so extreme. It's a man, as you said earlier, a man who had a very warped view of the world, but had the technical skill to create this system,
his little universe,
which could further that bizarre view of the world. The fundamentally fascinating thing about Terry's life for me is how, at the same time, his view of how most of the world works, or his model of how most of the world works, was so scrambled. Yet within that could sit this remarkable coherence that allowed him to design an operating system so that he could further explore his scrambled conception of the world.
Yeah. It's
how about we go through some of the parts of the TempleOS website
of talent and insanity?
Do you want to start with the? I sent you from Wayback Machine, the 2016 TempleOS.org homepage, because here it talks about some of the features of TempleOS, and also gives you a sense of Terry as a person. So it says, the first thing it says is, TempleOS is an x86_64 non-preemptive multitasking, multi-core, public domain, open source, ring zero only, single address map, identity mapped, non-networked PC operating system for recreational programming. It's like paging is not used. Straight away, a lot of that technical stuff I don't really understand, but he does say it's for recreational programming. And I really like that. He's acknowledging that the fun aspect of creating things. Like, this is for recreation. This is for fun. This is for exploration.
I watched a young
and I do appreciate that's front of center.
This young programmer responding to him. I can't remember what his YouTube channel is, but he was expressing this. Terry said, the reason why we're here is to entertain Mr. God. And this other programmer interpreted that as like having fun is important when you create stuff. And so this young programmer is building a game engine with like a 3D game engine. So he needs to do physics and stuff. And he was saying like, yeah, I know that Unity already exists or Unreal Engine already exists. And if I wanted to create a game, I could just go and create use those, and they're really good. But that's not the point. The reason why I'm making my own game engine is because I want to and because it's fun. And like, I'm writing everything myself, but I'm doing it because it's fun. And I find it interesting to explore this problem and to make my own things and not use other people's libraries, so that, I have full control over all aspects of the game engine. And yeah, it's not going to be commercially viable, but I'm just doing it for fun. And it's important to be able to have fun. And I found that really interesting, that he inspired this. And I actually watched several of there was another programmer from the PHP community who made this framework called TronGate, which is like this high performance PHP web framework that you can extend. It's like very extensible. And he's like, in his response, he's like, yeah, like, I'm doing it this way. And part of the reason why I'm doing it this way is because like some of the stuff that Terry said about like, like essentially doing these things for the fun of it, and because you care about like doing it your way and not just using other people's tools. I thought that was just really interesting.
Yeah,
it's like turned into like an inspiration for programmers. It's really interesting.
Speaking of inspiration, do you want to open up the TempleOS charter? Because that's interesting. We can look through that, because you see here that the collision of Terry's religious, like the religious part of Terry's character with technical considerations. I'll read the start. Why did they make Solomon's temple? It was a direction to look, to focus on, a special place for meditation, to do offerings, a community center, a home to God's beauty that encouraged love of God. People cherished God's temple, beautifying it with gold and all fine things to show love of God, as great cathedrals were decorated with astounding, awe-striking, intricate art and gargoyles, incredible devotion to God with hours of effort, toiling and slaving away for the glory of God, for families with children to see stained glass windows and tomes with ridiculously elaborate calligraphy to show love of God, from a people who did little else but show love towards God, lived in dire conditions by today's standards, yet with so much difficulty scraping by, found the time to devote even all free time to God. So, straight away, and then he starts quoting the Bible, straight away you know that this is a religious project. He's then got a bunch of dot points.
Should we read the dot points?
Talking about certain design decisions or high-level design decisions of TempleOS.
So I think we should just read.
Do you want to run through a few of these?
Yeah, let's run through them.
Yeah,
it's like less than a page. TempleOS.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, I want to read
the
really
King's illustrative.
The Kings. I want to read the part from Kings. He quoted King James version, 1 Kings 6:21. So Solomon overlaid the house within with pure gold, and he made a petition by the chains of gold before the oracle, and he overlaid it with gold, and the whole house he overlaid with gold, until he had finished all the house. Also, the whole altar that was by the oracle he overlaid with gold, and within the oracle he made 2 cherubims of olive tree, each 10 cubits high. So the devotion of King Solomon. And then he goes on to say, TempleOS is God's official temple. Just like Solomon's temple, this is a community focal point where offerings are made and God's oracle is consulted. Like the oracle that's from the simulator, from the Moses simulator. So he goes on to say, we can take turns if you want. Like, I don't mind. Like,
I can read about the graphics.
Yeah.
God said 680 by 480 16 color graphics is a covenant like circumcision. Children will do offerings. Think of 16 colors like the Simpsons cartoons. In the future, even if one GPU were universal, we would keep 640 by 480 16 color and not use GPU acceleration. Graphics operations should be transparent, not hidden in a GPU. And this is interesting because so you've got obvious religious inspiration. So he's saying this is God's resolution. This is God's color scheme. You've got 16 colors because God wants it. But then when he's talking about not hiding graphics operations within a GPU, that's coming back to the fun and transparency thing. So,
and accessibility.
I don't understand enough about how an operating system is going to interact with the GPU to do graphics calculations and how obscure or how transparent that is. Like, I do not know. But at least the way Terry seemed to see it was too obscure for it to be fun and too obscure for someone to just be able to tinker with it as someone would have with a Commodore 64. So he doesn't want it. He doesn't want GPU acceleration.
He doesn't want ray tracing.
No. He did not want ray tracing. No, CPU ray tracing.
Oh yeah.
It's fine. Yeah. Very computationally efficient. Yeah,
the next point is God said to use a single audio voice, a single frequency with waveforms, and maybe amplitude envelope. So the sounds that his operating system makes are really, they're like the old school NES.
They're grating.
Sounds. Yeah, really great. Really grating. God said his temple must be perfect. We don't think twice about breaking compatibility. He doesn't give a fuck. God said we do a 7-year release cycle. I say the PC hardware follows a 49-year jubilee cycle like broadcast TV upgrades. The vision is the same usage model and niche as the Commodore 64, a non-networked simple machine where programming was the goal, not just a means to an end.
That's interesting.
It's
interesting. The whole thing about how it should be fun. So programming's the goal. So the process of programming is what, at least in part, he was aiming at. That and communing with God. But at least part of the point was to program, not just to program for an instrumental purpose, but for the sake of programming.
That's so interesting. He actually had a really easy... he had a really interesting point of view on what he was trying to accomplish. Let me say, are there any other... load line count is the highest good, so it is easy to learn the whole thing. Users should see the light at the end of the tunnel. One file system, for example, is better than many file systems. There is a limit of 100,000. I think he ended up doing 150,000 lines or something, but maybe I'm misquoting there. Not including applications and demos. Oh, okay. So maybe it was like the demos and stuff added to it, but the actual operating system is less than 100,000 lines. Oh, that is actually really impressive. Yeah, that's really interesting.
There are a bunch of things here that I don't understand.
What's interesting is he said no networking, so malware is not an issue. Yeah, interesting. So he's trying to keep it pure.
Yeah, because I don't think he wanted to bother with permissions at all. Like you just do whatever.
That's so interesting.
And
yeah, so it's almost like the operating system itself. He was aiming for it to be like a toy. It's like here's a self-contained small operating system that you can go and understand, and then you can just like mess around with it however you want. Is almost like how he's thinking. But in order to like accomplish that, he needed to like make it minimal and not overcomplicated and not introduce like threat vectors like networking and stuff. That's so interesting. He should almost like, you could almost imagine like that inspiring like a new genre of operating systems, of like toy operating systems to like tinker with. That's really interesting.
Toy operating system is an interesting way to put it. Yeah. So this thing to play around with.
Yeah. And
again, so it's like that. It's these two things coexist. This sense of playfulness, but also it like there is divine worship. This is also to worship God.
Divine worship, playfulness, and then technical capabilities.
Yeah. What about we open up the purpose of life? This is Terry talking more about his more scrambled view of the world. He gets away from technical matters here. This is more reminiscent of actually how he wrote a number of his posts on various message boards. It's much more scrambled. He talks. There's a lot of Bible talk. Yeah, sure. I quote: "The Catholic purpose of life is to know God, love God, and obey God. Pope Francis said it was to serve the other. I am high priest of God's official temple, and I say the purpose of life is to do continual offerings to God like Cain and Abel and enjoy God's response. Francis has a charity. I have a church. Jesus said loving God was more important than loving neighbor." It is interesting. So in a number of his videos and a number of his streams, Terry talks about how it's really, really important, how entertainment is very important, and entertainment is really important for God. So humans exist in large part to entertain God. For God, humans are like soap operas, and God likes watching soap operas. Additionally, a source of entertainment for God is human offerings, and in many places, I think in TempleOS, you can offer offerings to God by mashing spacebar, that sort of thing. So he talks extensively about offerings. It's interesting too. He mentions talking to God here. So I quote: "There's something obviously different about people in the Bible compared to people today. God talked. Also, the people in the Bible were obsessed with doing offerings all the time. It is required that you do offerings before God will talk. Did the people in the Bible hear voices? Maybe. More likely, they used occult techniques such as an oracle. 1 Kings 6:20. Have you heard of tongues? 1 Corinthians 14:1. The idea is you let yourself be puppeted by a spirit, so you say things. You try to get a spirit, the Holy Spirit, to talk. You might as well use a Ouija board. However, it turns out that a Ouija board is bad for technical reasons. A really good technique is just randomly opening a book. God told me in an oracle that it is a covenant that you hold up your end of the conversation." So here we see a lot of aspects of Terry's view of the world and the design principles of TempleOS stated, where this idea of randomly opening a book, of randomness being an expression of God, it's good in a book. It's technically better in TempleOS because you can just press spacebar and you get random responses from God. And within TempleOS, you can do this, but you can also give offerings and talk to God. So he did biblically derive a number of TempleOS functions, which this whole project is it's just wild. It's a scrambled worldview, but given the intellectual heft to really bring it to fruition, to further it and deepen it.
It's devotional. It's truly the meaning of devotional.
It is devotional.
I'm not saying that I would like to have schizophrenia. Certainly not. It sounds horrible. But I'm kind of like, I kind of found myself, how would I put it? Not jealous, but kind of, I don't know if it's envious is the right word, of like the sense of devotional meaning that he got from it. I was like, man, imagine having something like that you're so committed to. You know, like obviously non-schizophrenic people can have that as well. They find something so powerful to just like commit themselves to like working on this thing for 10 years or 20 years or however long. I think that's cool. I would like that. It'd be nice to have something like that. It also seems exhausting, so maybe it's not. Maybe it's a double-edged sword.
What about this? God's favourite animals are bears and elephants. They are funny shaped. I think God must have seen too much starvation over the years. If the purpose of life is to know and love God, then a priest's job is to make everybody know and love God. By saying God likes bears and elephants, I did more toward that end than all priests in history. I also, what about this? When you pray, be witty and charming and rarely earnest. Enjoy God's company without imposing on him, and don't expect secrets of the universe. Earnestness in prayer is the root of much evil. Be entertaining. Don't remind him of sin. LOL. How about we do question and God's answers? So this is towards the bottom of the
purpose for life
of this page. Yeah, so he would ask God questions and then use the talk to God function to get answers back. So he'd normally get a really, really long string of text and then pick out a bit of it that he felt was meaningful. For example, question, war? God's answer, servicemen competing. Question, is the world perfectly just? God's answer, are you calling me lazy? So it's this combination of quite whimsical questions, quite deep questions, and then technical questions. So, for example, on using Markov chains, God's answer. No weights.
That's actually a pretty good answer. Just have a completely unweighted Markov chain. It's complete chaos.
But that's actually what he's doing, though, in some sense, with this talk to God function. Like it's just random. It is unweighted.
There's really, yeah. He had some wit, didn't he?
What about the Holocaust?
Oh, no.
Answer, wanted to compact the Jews.
Yep.
Or Arab/Jews as the question. Answer, oil funny hopefully. What about on racism? Sports.
On socialism.
Favorite thing on TV?
Pardon the French.
Soap operas. Likes Beverly Hillbillies.
Oil is the
favorite animal. Elephant 2. Favorite animal, bears. Favorite color, gold. Favorite color, iceberg blue. Favorite car, Beamer. Pets, homo. Sports, homo. Favorite sport, hockey. Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, homo. Smelling farts, Sodom. It's just there are so many of these as well. Just imagine constructing your worldview from this. Or what about elephants? Answer, mini skirts.
There's one hardest part of evolution, getting monkey mothers to hold babies nursing, smothering a problem. Yes. Happiest day in evolution.
What about
fruit? Significant thing in
Do
evolution.
you like chess
fish
people?
Shoulders.
Do not admire the proud.
He must have been just so weird. Just to think that this guy was like
I mean,
communing with a random word selector or random sentence generator. You know, imagine if he had access to ChatGPT. Like, man. I bet you
is ChatGPT unweighted enough, though?
Yeah, no.
I don't think it's sufficiently unweighted.
I bet you there's people with schizophrenia or whatever who are spending a lot of time talking to ChatGPT. I bet you that's happening somewhere.
I'm sure it is. What about his 11th? His commandments. He's got the 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not litter." 12th commandment: "Don't shoot unarmed men on the shitter." 13th commandment: "No gore unless it looks fake." 14th commandment: "No pedophilia or child porn." 15th commandment: "Don't eat rare meat with blood." 16th commandment: "No wife beating." 17th commandment: "Do not swing from radio towers with one hand." That sounds like more of a niche one.
Helpful advice from God. I like at the
opening of Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
Ouch.
He finishes it with "on death, awful." Opening of Saving Private Ryan.
Awful.
Ouch. Like, have some trivial questions for God, have some profound questions for God.
His demands page too is pretty funny because a lot of these are sort of divinely inspired demands of other software developers. For example, I quote, "Microsoft must cancel Secure Boot because it makes dual booting impossible. TempleOS is an additional operating system that must be used alongside Windows or Linux, not as a replacement. It must dual boot because it has no networking. Real hardware as opposed to VMware is like the difference between looking in a telescope eyepiece versus just looking at an offline image. God said the Commodore 64/Apple II generation owed ancestral lands. VMware is like being taken off of our land and moved into a reservation. In this case, however, it will not stand." And he's got a lot of these. Another demand: "VMware has a bug stretching 640 by 480 16 color to full screen. VMware's PC speakers distortion is a good idea, but it is too much for hymns." He's got a lot of these. Again, this mashup of obvious technical knowledge with actual schizophrenia, just frank delusions. It's just wild. TempleOS is wild.
He says, you'll like this one, Jack, down the bottom. He says, "Microsoft Paint and Linux's GIMP must support TempleOS GRA files. They are blemish-free, unlike BMP files."
He really does not like bitmap files. He complains about bitmap and wave files a lot, and he uses them as, I guess, canonical examples as to why you should design things to be perfect and then not update, which was his plan for TempleOS. Because he says both of those things, bitmap and wave files, started off good and just got shitter and shitter as they were updated over time. How much more do you have to say about TempleOS?
Not a huge amount. I think it's pretty wacky.
I guess actually we could make more reference to Terry's way of communicating, because I anticipate that's probably how a lot of people know about him. I think also, like, certain people will by using the term glowy online to refer to an intelligence agent will be knowingly or not referencing Terry, because there's a particular clip of him when he's streaming himself very agitatedly talking about glow fellas, saying that CIA agents glow in the dark. They're glow fellas, and so you should just run them over in your car when you see them. So yeah, that's the etymology of the term glowy, to refer to an intelligence agent online. Terry's unique way of communicating definitely got more pronounced as his schizophrenia worsened. Became more and more vulgar and more full of racial slurs that were... It's a combination of, I think he was using them apparently to ward off psychological warfare tactics by intelligence agencies, as well as the British Broadcasting Corporation. But also, as his schizophrenia got more and more dense, I think there did seem to be an element of just racial resentment to it as well. So there are videos of him when he was still living with his parents but becoming unmanageable, screaming at his dad about someone being black, and his dad saying, "I don't care if he is black, what does it matter?" And Terry just saying, like, "No, it matters, it matters, it matters." So it's sort of hard to know. So I've seen online many people say, Terry was just using it to scramble what he thought were intelligence agencies trying to stop him from building the third temple. There wasn't a malicious component to it. But he certainly does seem to be developing more and more malice in it as he got older and as the schizophrenia got worse.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
To what extent you say, like, you should I don't know, hold a really, really sick man accountable for this. His brain was pretty scrambled, especially by the time he was using racial slurs extensively.
I think he also was like smoking a lot of weed, I think, in certain points of his life, he mentioned, which like is going to exacerbate the his illness. So yeah, I don't know.
I don't really have anything else to say about Terry's particular use of language. I wouldn't even really bring it up, besides the fact that many people seem to know him just for this reason, that he was that schizophrenic guy who would program while just dropping N-bombs on stream. So it's worth just briefly mentioning. It's far from the most interesting part of Terry.
It's like the least interesting part.
If you watch his videos, there's Terryese you need to learn to filter.
To me, it's just like he was a very sick person, and this was one part of his illness. And he was also like really aggressive as well. That was another part of he would just like flip out and stuff and just start yelling at people.
And that grew more pronounced.
That was part of him becoming more and more unwell as he got older. Yeah.
Yeah. Far from the most interesting aspect of Terry, but one that has got him, like, he's still a niche figure, but one that seems to have gotten him very minor internet notoriety.
Yeah. I don't have a huge amount else. Do you have anything else to mention?
Me neither. Also, because, people won't be aware of this because we talked about it beforehand. I'm sick and I'm just loaded on caffeine and Panadols at the moment, and so I've got a definite shelf life for this episode.
Yeah,
I'll get a crash pretty soon. So we normally finish these episodes by talking about whether we would recommend something or not. In the case of Terry Davis and TempleOS, it's not as straightforward as should you or should you not read a given book by a given author. Should you install TempleOS on a virtual machine and have a go of it? I don't know. I haven't done that. If you're technically competent and you want to do that and explore it, have a go, I guess.
Just download.
Should you watch Terry's videos I think actually, yeah, it's pretty interesting seeing this interface between technical coherence and a schizophrenic worldview. I'll include the archive.org link to all of Terry's videos in the show notes so that people can just flick through
So
those.
like
There are
some of his highlights.
hours and hours and hours of videos.
Yeah.
Particularly seeing the ones where he's programming in TempleOS. Like those are just interesting. It's interesting seeing this man create a coherent structure within the framework of a completely scrambled sense of reality. It's genuinely interesting.
And also, if you read some of
his writings, you can find on Wayback Machine. Those are interesting too. I guess in totality, would I recommend Terry Davis? Yeah, have a look at him. He's interesting. It's also a cautionary tale. If anyone listening has particularly mental illnesses which can go psychotic, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, it's also a good motivation to get treated, to stay treated, because they can go bad really quickly.
Yeah. Read some of like the comments as well. Like people really like him. he inspired a lot of people and a lot of conversations. And I think that's kind of, it's interesting. He has a strange legacy for somebody who
it's a very odd legacy.
who is so unwell. But just the fact that he's inspiring programmers to just pursue the things that they find creatively fun, I think is like all around the world. I think that's a beautiful legacy to have, even if he achieved it in a very strange way. There is one thing to note. He says on his TempleOS.org website, which I assume is being maintained by his estate or his fans, it says, in the wake of Terry Davis's passing, his family has requested supporters of his to donate to organizations working to ease the pain and suffering caused by mental illness, such as the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So, hey, like if you like this episode and if you go and check out TempleOS or whatever, like donate to one of those organizations. That's also a good part of his legacy. That's been doing good stuff. I did have one final quote to leave the episode with from him that I really liked. And when he was talking about TempleOS, he said, he must have had a bird, I assume, or maybe this was a bird who came to like his windowsill.
Oh, the fucking birds! No, if you watch his videos, those things are chirping through so many of them. It's so fucking annoying.
So he says
it's continuous.
He says,
I've completely forgot to mention that. Yeah, that's a huge feature of some of his videos. It's just fucking birds. Jesus.
He says, quote, "When my bird was looking at my computer, I thought, whoa, that bird has no idea what he's looking at. And yet, what does the bird do? Does he panic? No, he can't really panic. He just does the best he can. Is he able to live in a world where he's so ignorant? Well, he doesn't really have a choice. He can kind of live. Usually the bird's okay, even though he doesn't understand the world. And he can kind of learn what's safe and what's dangerous. So, that's where I've been living. Just a bird looking at TempleOS in a world that's dangerous."
Yeah.
Poor Terry.
Poor Terry. God bless.
Yeah. Go and check it out. I think it's cool. Go and check it out.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of next episode, I've been sick, so I haven't I haven't organized what we're doing next week, but we'll be doing something. This is the first episode in quite a while that we've recorded video for, so if you're interested in seeing our faces, you can go on YouTube and watch us talk about TempleOS. Preferably listen to this on as many audio platforms as possible before watching it multiple times in a row on YouTube. Levi finally convinced me again to record my face. I don't really like being on camera.
Yeah,
So
we'll get used to it.
hopefully this episode wasn't too stilted.
We'll get used to it.
Yeah, we'll get used to it.
I think it's nice. Get another skill to learn and another way to connect with our audience if they're interested in watching two guys talk to each other.
Gazing
online.
upon our faces.
Yeah.
Lovingly watching
It
us
won't be a
talk
particularly
about Terry
interesting
Davis.
like visual experience. But I guess if you like looking at our faces, fine. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening. See you next time.